Montana Territory, August 1873. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Montana grasslands as 25-year-old Declan Yarrow rode alone across the vast emptiness, his chestnut mare's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Sweat gathered beneath the brim of his tan cowboy hat, trickling down his clean-shaven jaw as he scanned the horizon with practiced wariness. This country could kill a man in a dozen different ways: thirst, snakebite, hostile Indians, or worse, the lawless drifters who preyed on travelers like wolves on wounded deer. Declan had learned that lesson the hard way 3 years ago when Sioux raiders attacked his family's wagon heading west. His father and younger brother had died protecting the women, and though his mother and sister survived, something in Declan had broken that day. He'd watched his father take his final breath while declaring his love for their family, and Declan had sworn then that he'd never make himself vulnerable like that again. Love was a weakness out here. The frontier respected only strength, solitude, and survival. A man who let himself care too deeply was a man who'd lose everything. Since then, he'd worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, earning a reputation as a reliable hand who kept to himself. He wanted nothing more than to save enough money to buy a small ranch where he could live alone, beholden to no one, vulnerable to nothing. The heart he'd once possessed, open and eager for connection, had hardened into something cold and practical. That's how a man survived out here. But as his mare crested a low rise, Declan spotted something that made him rein in sharply. A wagon sat tilted in the shallow ravine below, one wheel clearly broken. A woman in a dark blue dress knelt beside it, her blonde hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet. Even from this distance, he could see her shoulders shaking. His first instinct was to turn away, not his problem. The frontier was full of stranded folks, and stopping to help strangers could cost you everything: your supplies, your horse, even your life. He'd heard stories of confidence men using women as bait for robberies. But something kept him there, watching. The woman stood, wiping her face, and looked around the empty landscape with what even from this distance appeared to be growing desperation. No other travelers were visible in any direction. If he rode on, she might die out here. The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest. Declan cursed under his breath and nudged his mare forward down the slope. The woman spun at the sound of hoofbeats, her hand flying to her chest. As he drew closer, Declan could see she was young, maybe 22 or 23, with honey blonde hair that caught the sunlight and striking blue eyes reddened from crying. Her dress, though dusty from travel, was well-made and modest, with a high collar and long sleeves. A widow's dress, he realized, noting the black mourning ribbon pinned to her bodice. "Please," she called out, her voice trembling. "Please, I need help. My wheel broke and I have no tools to fix it." Declan stopped a safe distance away, his hand resting casually near the Colt revolver at his hip. "Where's your husband, ma'am?" Her face crumpled, dead. 3 months now. I'm traveling to my sister's ranch near Helena, but the wheel just gave way. He studied her carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden accomplices in the rocks. But there was nothing, just a young widow, genuinely stranded and terrified. Against his better judgment, against every principle of self-preservation he'd developed, he dismounted. Name's Declan Yarrow. "Let me take a look at that wheel." Relief flooded her features. "Emma Jane Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Yarrow, thank you so much. I thought I might die out here." As Declan examined the wagon wheel, he could feel Emma watching him. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was shattered beyond simple repair. The wooden spokes had split in multiple places, likely from hitting a hidden rock at speed. He'd need tools and materials he didn't have. "This wheel's done for," he said, straightening. "But I can rig something temporary to get you to the next town. Clearwater Station is about 15 miles east. There's a blacksmith there who can fix you up proper." Emma's shoulders sagged with relief. "I can pay you for your time." "Don't want your money, ma'am." The words came out harsher than he intended. He didn't want payment because payment would mean he'd done this for gain, when the truth was he'd stopped for reasons he couldn't quite explain to himself. And that uncertainty irritated him. For the next hour, Declan worked in the blazing sun, reinforcing the broken wheel with rope and spare wood from Emma's supplies. She tried to help, fetching tools and holding boards steady, and he found himself grudgingly impressed by her composure. Most women he'd known would be hysterical after being stranded alone in the wilderness, but Emma seemed determined to be useful rather than helpless. "Your husband, what happened to him?" Declan asked as he tested the makeshift repair. The question surprised him. He usually avoided personal conversations. Emma was quiet for a moment. Cholera. We'd only been married 8 months. We were planning to start a cattle ranch together, but then he took sick, and within 3 days he was gone. Her voice remained steady, though pain threaded through every word. The bank took our land for debts, and I had nowhere else to go but my sister's place. Declan felt an unwelcome surge of sympathy. He'd built walls around his heart specifically to avoid feeling things like this, the pain of others, the desire to protect and comfort. Those feelings led to attachment, and attachment led to loss. Better to stay alone. "That's rough," he said curtly, standing and wiping his hands on his trousers. "This should hold to Clearwater if you go slow, real slow, and stick to the smoothest ground you can find." Emma stepped closer, and for the first time he noticed the delicate features of her face, the way her eyes reflected both sorrow and strength. "You're a good man, Mr. Yarrow. There aren't many who would stop to help a stranger out here." "Don't mistake one good deed for a good man, ma'am." He turned away, gathering his tools. "Frontier's no place for trust or sentiment. You do well to remember that." But as he said it, he felt the words ring hollow. If the frontier was no place for human kindness, what had made him stop? What had overridden his careful self-preservation? "Will you at least ride with me to Clearwater?" Emma asked. "To make sure the wheel holds, I could fix you supper when we arrive. It's the least I can do." Every instinct told Declan to refuse, to ride away now before whatever this was could take root. But he looked at her wagon with its jury-rigged wheel and knew she'd never make it alone if something went wrong. "I'll follow behind," he said. "Make sure you don't run into trouble." They set out as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Emma handled the wagon well, keeping the horses to a careful walk and steering around the roughest terrain. Declan rode behind, telling himself he was simply seeing a job through to completion, but unable to ignore the way his eyes kept drifting to her straight back and determined posture. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, they made camp beside a narrow creek. Declan insisted on separate fires, maintaining proper distance, but when Emma proved adept at cooking beans and salt pork over the flames, he found himself drifting closer to accept the plate she offered. "You handle yourself well out here," he observed, settling onto a rock near her fire but not too close. "Most women from back east would be useless in the wild." Emma smiled faintly. "My father was an army scout. He taught me and my sister how to survive before he died. Said women needed those skills just as much as men, maybe more." She poked at the fire with a stick. "Of course, my mother thought it most unladylike. She wanted us to focus on embroidery and piano." "Your mother was wrong," Declan said. "Skills keep you alive, embroidery doesn't. You sound like you don't think much of society's softer things. The frontier strips away everything soft, only the hard survive." Even as he said it, Declan wondered who he was trying to convince, her or himself. Emma studied him across the firelight. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." Her words struck deeper than they should have. Declan stood abruptly. "Lonely's better than dead. I'll take first watch." "You get some sleep." He walked to the edge of their camp, angry at himself for lingering, for talking, for noticing the way firelight caught in her hair. This was exactly what he'd sworn to avoid, connection, however small. Tomorrow they'd reach Clearwater and he'd ride on, and this strange encounter would fade like so many others. But as the night deepened and he heard Emma's breathing slow into sleep, Declan found himself watching over her with an unfamiliar protectiveness that unsettled him deeply. Something about this woman, her courage, her resilience, her refusal to be destroyed by loss, called to something buried inside him that he'd thought long dead. He told himself it meant nothing. Tomorrow he'd leave. Tomorrow he'd be alone again. That was how it had to be. But as shooting stars traced silver paths across the vast Montana sky, Declan Yarrow wondered if some things, once encountered, could ever truly be left behind. The next morning dawned cool and clear. Declan had slept poorly during his brief rest, plagued by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He found Emma already up, rekindling the fire for coffee. The domesticity of the scene stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. "Morning," she said, glancing up with a tentative smile. "Coffee will be ready soon." They broke camp in awkward silence, Declan checking the wagon wheel while Emma packed her supplies. The repair had held through the night, which meant they'd likely make Clearwater Station by afternoon. Then this would be over. The thought should have brought relief, but instead Declan felt something closer to disappointment. As they traveled through the morning, the landscape gradually changed from open grassland to rolling hills dotted with pine. They passed a burned-out homestead, its blackened timbers stark against the green hillside. Emma stared at it silently, and Declan knew she was thinking of her own lost home. "Sue," she asked quietly, "most likely or outlaws?" Hard to tell the difference sometimes in terms of outcome. He kept his tone matter of fact. This country takes what it wants. People think they can build something lasting out here, but the frontier has other ideas. You don't believe in building anything permanent. I believe in surviving. Emma was quiet for a moment. My sister and her husband have a successful ranch. They've been there 7 years. They have a home, children, a life. Then they're lucky, or they haven't faced their reckoning yet. Or maybe they've found that having people to fight for makes them stronger, not weaker. Declan's jaw tightened. How did that work out for your husband? He regretted the words instantly. Emma's face went pale, and she turned away, focusing intently on the trail ahead. Guilt crashed through Declan's defenses, guilt and shame at using her grief as a weapon simply because she'd challenged his worldview. "I shouldn't have said that," he said after a long, painful silence. "That was cruel." "But you meant it," Emma replied without looking at him. "You think loving people is a weakness. I think caring makes you vulnerable, and vulnerable gets you killed out here. Or maybe refusing to care is just another way of dying." Now Emma did look at him, her blue eyes steady and sad. "I loved Thomas. I loved him deeply, and losing him broke something in me I'm not sure will ever fully heal. But I don't regret loving him, not for a moment. Those 8 months we had were worth all the pain that followed." Declan had no answer for that. Her words struck at the foundation of everything he'd built his life on for the past 3 years. He'd convinced himself that his isolation was strength, that his emotional walls were armor. But looking at Emma, who'd lost just as much as he had yet somehow remained open to life, he felt a crack forming in those walls, small but significant. They rode in silence for another hour. Then, as they crested a rise, Emma pointed ahead. "Is that smoke?" Declan followed her gesture and felt his muscles tense. Dark smoke billowed into the sky from the direction of Clearwater Station, too much smoke for cooking fires. His hand dropped instinctively to his revolver. "Something's wrong, stay close to me." They approached cautiously, Declan riding ahead to scout. What he found made his blood run cold. Clearwater Station was burning. Bodies lay scattered in the street, the storekeeper, the blacksmith, and several others. The attack was recent, the blood was still fresh. He rode back quickly to Emma. "Raiders hit the town, everyone's dead, we need to move now." "If they're still in the area." A gunshot cracked the air, and Emma's wagon horse screamed. Declan wheeled his mare around to see 3 riders emerging from a stand of trees, guns drawn. Outlaws by the look of them, hard-faced men with dead eyes and predatory grins. "Well now," the lead rider called out, a bearded man with a scar across his cheek. "Looks like we got us some stragglers, that's convenient." Declan positioned his horse between the outlaws and Emma. "Ride," he said to her in a low, urgent voice. "Ride hard and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "Go." But it was too late. The outlaws had spread out, surrounding them. The scarred man laughed. "Ain't no one going nowhere. Now you two are gonna step down real slow and hand over anything valuable you got. Might let you live if you cooperate." Declan knew that was a lie. These men had just slaughtered an entire town. They wouldn't leave witnesses. His mind raced, calculating odds and angles. 3 armed men against him with Emma to protect. The mathematics were brutal. "Let the woman go," Declan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "She's got nothing worth taking. You want the horse and supplies, they're yours, just let her ride on." The scarred man's grin widened. "Oh, I think the lady's got plenty worth taking, pretty thing like that." His implications were clear and sickening. Declan felt something primal surge through him, not the calculated survival instinct he'd cultivated, but something fiercer and older. The thought of these men touching Emma triggered a protective rage he hadn't felt since he'd fought beside his father 3 years ago. In that moment, the walls around his heart didn't just crack, they shattered. He'd spent 3 years telling himself that caring made you weak, that attachment was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. But as he sat between Emma and danger, Declan understood with sudden clarity that he'd been wrong. The willingness to fight for something beyond yourself, to risk everything for someone else, that wasn't weakness. That was what made you human, that was what gave life meaning. And in that instant, Declan knew he was willing to die to keep Emma safe. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Ride away now and live." The scarred man's laughter died. "Big talk for one man," he raised his revolver. "Kill him." "Take the woman." Declan drew and fired in one fluid motion. His first shot took the scarred man in the chest, the second caught the rider to the left in the shoulder. The third outlaw got a shot off that whistled past Declan's ear before Declan's third bullet found its mark. The gunfight lasted perhaps 5 seconds. In the ringing silence that followed, 3 bodies lay in the dust, and Declan's mare was dancing nervously beneath him, spooked by the violence. He turned to Emma, who sat frozen in her wagon, her face white as paper. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head mutely. "We need to move. There might be more of them, and those gunshots will carry for miles." His hands were steady as he reloaded his Colt, but inside he was shaking. Not from the killing, he'd done what was necessary, but from the realization of what he'd been willing to sacrifice. They left Clearwater Station and its horrors behind, riding hard through the afternoon. Neither spoke, the weight of violence and near death hanging heavy between them. As evening approached, they stopped in a protected hollow surrounded by large boulders that would hide their fire and provide defensive positions. Emma climbed down from the wagon stiffly, as if her body had finally caught up with the terror of what had happened. She walked a few steps away, and then her legs seemed to give out. She sank to the ground, shaking. Declan was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. "Hey, you're safe now, it's over." "You killed them," her voice was barely a whisper. "You killed 3 men. I did what I had to do. They would have killed us both, or worse." Emma looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You could have died. If their aim had been better, if you'd been slower, you could have died protecting me." "But I didn't." "Why?" She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Why did you risk your life for me? You don't even know me. You said yourself, the frontier's no place for caring about people." Declan found himself kneeling in the dust beside her, the walls he'd so carefully constructed crumbling completely. "I don't know," he said hoarsely. "Or maybe I do know and I'm afraid to admit it. Emma, I spent 3 years convinced that not caring was how you survive out here. I watched my father die protecting people he loved, and I swore I'd never make that mistake. I'd stay alone, stay hard, never let anyone matter enough to break me." He took a shaky breath. "But then I saw you stranded by that broken wagon, and something in me couldn't just ride away. And today, when those men threatened you, Emma, I would have died to keep you safe. That terrifies me more than any outlaw's gun." Emma's eyes searched his face. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because it means I care, it means you matter. And people who matter can be lost, and losing them destroys you. I've spent 3 years trying not to be destroyed again." Emma reached up and touched his face with gentle fingers. "Declan, have you considered that maybe you've been destroying yourself all along? That living without connection, without love, isn't really living at all." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He thought of the past 3 years, the empty nights, the walls he'd built, the careful numbness he'd cultivated. He'd told himself it was strength, but now, kneeling in the dust beside this woman he barely knew, he saw it for what it was: fear. "Cowardice dressed up as survival strategy. I don't know how to be any other way anymore," he admitted. Emma smiled through her tears. "Maybe you could learn if you wanted to." They made camp as darkness fell, but everything had shifted between them. Declan found himself sitting closer to Emma's fire, talking with her about things he hadn't discussed with anyone in years. He told her about his family, about watching his father die, about the guilt and fear that had shaped him. Emma listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that made him think deeper about his choices. In turn, she told him about her life before Thomas, about growing up with an unconventional father who taught his daughters to shoot and track, about her brief, happy marriage and the devastation of widowhood. Her openness amazed him, how she could speak of painful things without closing off, how she'd maintained her capacity for hope despite loss. "How do you do it?" he asked as the fire burned low. "How do you stay open after everything you've been through?" Emma considered the question. "I suppose because the alternative is worse. Yes, I lost Thomas, and that pain was unbearable. But those 8 months we had, they were the most alive I've ever felt, and I'd rather have that, even knowing how it ended, than live a whole lifetime safe and numb and alone. She looked at him steadily. I think you would too, if you let yourself. Declan wanted to argue to defend his carefully constructed philosophy. But he couldn't, not anymore. Not after he'd felt what he'd felt today, that fierce, overwhelming need to protect her, the way his heart had lurched when she'd smiled at him, the peace he felt sitting here beside her fire. What if I don't know how to start? He asked quietly. Emma reached across the small space between them and took his hand. The gesture was simple, uncomplicated, but it sent warmth flooding through Declan's chest. Maybe you just did, she said. They sat like that until the fire died to embers, hands linked, neither wanting to break the connection. When they finally separated to sleep, Declan lay awake beneath the stars, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in his universe. For 3 years, he'd been running from the possibility of caring, convinced it would destroy him. But now he wondered if perhaps the real destruction had been in the running itself. Emma Jane Johnson had somehow slipped past his defenses without even trying, simply by being herself, brave, honest, open-hearted despite her pain. And now, lying in the darkness, Declan had to face an uncomfortable truth. He didn't want to ride away from her tomorrow or ever. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in 3 years, he felt something like hope. The next morning brought a difficult decision. With Clearwater Station destroyed, they needed to find another settlement. The nearest was Silver Creek, a mining town about 40 miles north, but Emma's sister's ranch was in the opposite direction, toward Helena. I should get you to your sister's, Declan said as they broke camp. That's where you were headed. Emma secured a bundle in the wagon, not meeting his eyes. That's still 3 days' travel at least. You've already done more than anyone could expect. You should go wherever you were headed before you met me. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. This was their chance to part ways, to return to their separate lives, the practical thing to do, the safe thing. Declan found he didn't want safe anymore. I was heading nowhere in particular, he said, just drifting from job to job, town to town, no place I need to be. He paused, then added quietly, unless you'd rather I didn't come with you. I'd understand that. Emma looked at him then, her blue eyes intense. I'd very much like you to come with me, if you want to. I want to. They set out toward Helena with an unspoken understanding that something had changed between them, though neither quite knew how to name it. The landscape shifted as they traveled, mountains rising purple in the distance, pine forests thickening. They fell into an easy rhythm, Declan scouting ahead, then dropping back to ride alongside Emma's wagon, their conversations ranging from practical matters to deeper territory. Emma told him about her sister, Catherine, who'd married a rancher named William Morris 5 years ago. Catherine was always the brave one, Emma said with a mixture of admiration and wistfulness. When father died, mother wanted us to move to Philadelphia and live with her sister, but Catherine insisted on coming west with William. I stayed back east, tried to be the proper daughter mother wanted. But you married Thomas and came west anyway. Thomas made me brave. He saw something in me I didn't see in myself, that I was more like my father than my mother, that I belonged out here in the wild places. She smiled sadly. He was right. I miss him terribly, but I don't regret coming west. Even after everything, this feels like home. Declan understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. Despite all the violence and loss he'd experienced out here, he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The vast landscapes, the freedom, the way you could ride for days without seeing another soul, it suited something in his nature. You ever think about settling somewhere? Emma asked. Building something permanent. Used to. Before my family was killed, my father talked about us homesteading together, building a ranch. After he died, I gave up on that dream, seemed safer to keep moving. And now? Declan glanced at her, at the way afternoon sunlight caught in her blonde hair, at the directness in her eyes that never let him hide behind easy answers. Now I'm starting to think maybe I gave up too soon. That night they camped beside a small lake surrounded by aspens. The evening was warm and still, the water reflecting the surrounding mountains like a mirror. After supper, Emma surprised Declan by pulling a book from her wagon, a worn copy of poetry. Thomas gave me this, she explained, settling onto a fallen log. He used to read to me in the evenings. Would you think me foolish if I read some aloud? It helps me feel less lonely. I wouldn't think you foolish. Emma opened the book and began to read. Her voice was soft but clear, the words flowing like water. Declan had never been much for poetry. It seemed impractical, frivolous even, but listening to Emma read, he began to understand its purpose. The poems spoke of love and loss, courage and fear, the eternal human struggle to find meaning in a harsh world. They gave voice to feelings he'd tried to suppress for years. When Emma finished and closed the book, the silence felt sacred somehow. Declan moved to sit beside her on the log, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. Thomas believed poetry was just as important as practical skills. He said humans need beauty and meaning as much as they need food and shelter. He sounds like he was a good man. He was. Emma turned to look at Declan. But I think you need to know something. I loved him deeply and I still grieve him. That grief doesn't just disappear. I know that. But grief doesn't mean my heart stopped working altogether. It doesn't mean I can't feel new things, care for new people. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I want you to understand that what I'm feeling for you, it doesn't diminish what I felt for Thomas. It's different, but it's real. Declan's breath caught. They'd been circling around this thing between them for days, acknowledging it in small ways but never speaking it directly. Now here it was, laid bare between them. Emma, I need you to understand something too. I'm not good at this. I've spent 3 years building walls, keeping people out. I'm damaged in ways that might not be fixable. Emma reached for his hand again, that simple gesture that had come to mean so much. We're all damaged, Declan. The question is whether we let that damage close us off forever, or whether we find someone willing to help us heal. He looked at their joined hands, at the contrast of her small, delicate fingers against his rough, calloused ones. Cowboy's hands and a widow's hands, both marked by loss and hardship, but there was something right about the way they fit together. I'm afraid, he admitted, of losing you, of failing to protect you, of caring so much it destroys me. I'm afraid too, Emma said, but I'm more afraid of never taking the chance. Of letting fear rob me of something that could be beautiful. Declan lifted his free hand and gently touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb. Emma's eyes fluttered, closed at the contact, and he felt her lean into his touch. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. Emma, he said softly, I think I'm falling in love with you. I don't know how it happened so fast. Maybe it started when I first saw you by that broken wagon, or maybe when I realized I'd die to keep you safe. But it's happening, and I can't stop it even if I wanted to. She opened her eyes, and they were shining with tears. I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me just as much as it terrifies you. But Declan, I'd rather be terrified together than safe and alone. He kissed her then, softly at first, then with growing certainty. Emma's arms came around his neck, and for long moments there was nothing but the two of them and the tremendous leap of faith they were taking together. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. We should probably take this slow, Emma said breathlessly. Court properly. I'm still in mourning and people will talk. I don't care what people say, Declan interrupted. But I want to do this right. I want to court you properly, meet your sister and her husband, earn their approval. I want to build something lasting with you, not just some quick frontier romance that burns out. Emma smiled, radiant even in the gathering darkness. Then that's what we'll do. They sat together by the lake as stars began to appear, talking and planning and dreaming in ways Declan hadn't allowed himself in years. He told her about his idea of a ranch, about the kind of life he'd once imagined building. Emma shared her own dreams of a home filled with warmth and laughter, of children eventually, of building something meaningful in this wild country. My sister wrote that they need help on their ranch, Emma said. William's been trying to manage everything himself, but it's too much for one man. Maybe you could work there for a while. It would give us time to know each other better, and you'd have steady work. Would your sister approve? A drifter cowboy courting her widowed sister. Catherine judges people by their character, not their circumstances. If you're honest with her, treat me with respect and prove yourself willing to work hard, she'll give you a chance. Declan considered this. The old him would have balked at the idea of settling down, of making himself accountable to a family and a place. But the old him was dying, replaced by someone who could imagine a future beyond mere survival. "Then that's what I'll do," he said. "I'll work for your brother-in-law, court you proper, and prove I'm worthy of you." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "You already proved you're worthy when you chose to stop and help a stranded widow. Everything since then has just confirmed it." They continued north over the next 2 days, and Declan felt the shift in himself deepening. The constant vigilance he'd maintained for 3 years began to ease. He still watched for danger that would never completely leave him, but now he had something to watch for, not just against. He had Emma to protect, a future to build toward, a reason to hope. Emma seemed to be blooming as well, the grief that had weighed her down lifting incrementally. She laughed more easily, talked more freely about Thomas without the conversations being shadowed by overwhelming sadness. Declan realized that grief didn't have to mean the end of joy, that both could coexist, that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the future. On the 3rd evening they crested a rise and Emma pointed excitedly. "There, that's Catherine's ranch." Below them, nestled in a protected valley, was a substantial log house with several outbuildings, corrals, and grazing cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Declan could see figures moving between the buildings. It looked prosperous and permanent, exactly the kind of life he'd convinced himself was impossible. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. As they descended toward the ranch, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the evening sun. When she recognized Emma's wagon, she let out a shout and began running toward them. Emma jumped down before the wagon had fully stopped, and the two sisters collided in a fierce embrace, both crying and laughing. A tall, broad-shouldered man followed at a more measured pace. William Morris, Declan assumed. He had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life working hard outdoors, with keen eyes that assessed Declan carefully as he dismounted. Catherine pulled back from Emma, holding her at arm's length. "Let me look at you." "Oh, Emma, I'm so glad you're finally here. When your letter said you were coming, I was worried sick about you traveling alone." "I wasn't alone," Emma said, turning to Declan. "This is Declan Yarrow. He saved my life more than once on the journey here." Catherine's eyes went wide as Emma quickly recounted the broken wagon, the attack at Clearwater Station, and Declan's intervention. William stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sounds like we owe you a considerable debt, Mr. Yarrow. Any man who'd risk his life for a stranger is welcome at our table." Declan shook his hand, appreciating the firm, honest grip. "I was glad to help, sir. Emma's a remarkable woman." Something knowing flickered in William's eyes. "That she is. Come on inside, both of you. You must be exhausted, and Catherine's been cooking enough to feed an army in anticipation of Emma's arrival." The next hours passed in a warm blur. Inside the log house, Declan was introduced to Catherine and William's 3 children, 2 boys aged 6 and 4, and a baby girl. The family's warmth and easy affection with each other made Declan's chest ache with both longing and loss. This was what he'd had once before the raid. This was what he'd convinced himself he could never have again. Over dinner, Catherine skillfully drew out the full story of how Declan and Emma had met and traveled together. Her eyes kept moving between them, and Declan knew she was assessing not just what they said, but what lay unspoken beneath the words. After the meal, while Emma helped Catherine settle the children for bed, William invited Declan out to the porch. The 2 men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "So," William said eventually, "you have feelings for Emma." It wasn't a question. Declan considered denying it, then decided honesty was the only acceptable approach. "Yes, sir, I do. Strong feelings. I intend to court her properly, if she and you all are agreeable. Emma just lost her husband 3 months ago. Some would say it's too soon. I know that, and if Emma needs more time, I'll wait. I'm not going anywhere." William glanced at him. "What are your prospects? Emma mentioned you're a cowboy without any land or permanent position." "That's true. I've saved some money, but not enough to buy property yet. What I can offer is hard work, complete honesty, and a promise to protect and provide for her to the best of my ability. Can I ask you something personal, Mr. Yarrow?" "Declan, please." "And yes, sir." "What changed? Emma said you told her the frontier was no place for caring about people, that you'd spent years keeping yourself isolated. What made you stop for her wagon?" "What made you stay?" Declan thought about how to answer that. Honestly, I don't know what made me stop. Maybe I was tired of being alone even if I couldn't admit it. But what made me stay, that's easier to answer. Emma challenged everything I thought I believed. She'd lost just as much as I had but somehow remained open to life, to hope, to love. She showed me that my isolation wasn't strength, it was just fear dressed up in different clothes. He paused, then continued. I love your sister-in-law, William. I know it's fast and unconventional, but I've spent 3 years running from any possibility of caring about someone, and it nearly destroyed me. Emma brought me back to life. I want to be worthy of that gift. William was quiet for a long moment. Emma's been through hell. She loved Thomas deeply, and his death broke something in her. But tonight, I see something in her I haven't seen since before he died. Hope maybe life, you did that. She did it herself. I just gave her a reason to let it show. Catherine will want Emma to wait a full year before remarrying. That's proper mourning period. Then I'll wait a year. Like I said, I'm not going anywhere. William smiled and extended his hand again. Then welcome to the family, Declan, and I'd like to take you up on your offer of hard work. I could use another experienced hand around here. The pay isn't much, but room and board are included, and you'd be learning the operation if you ever want to start your own place. Declan felt something tight in his chest loosen. This was the future he'd given up on, a place to belong, people to care about, work that meant something. And all because he'd stopped to help a woman with a broken wagon wheel. The next months unfolded with a rhythm that felt both foreign and deeply right to Declan. He moved into the bunkhouse, a small but solid structure William had built for hired hands. The work was hard but satisfying. Mending fences, tending cattle, breaking horses, preparing for the harsh Montana winter ahead. But the best part of each day was the time he spent with Emma. They courted with old-fashioned propriety, always chaperoned, never alone for too long, carefully respectful of both Emma's mourning period and the need to protect her reputation. Yet within those boundaries, something deep and lasting was growing. They took walks in the evening with Catherine or William trailing discreetly behind. They sat together on the porch after supper, talking about everything and nothing. Emma taught Declan to appreciate poetry and literature. Declan taught Emma to shoot with greater accuracy and handle horses with more confidence. Catherine and William watched their courtship with approval and occasional amusement. You two are like a pair of teenagers, Catherine teased one evening. The way you look at each other when you think no one's watching. Emma blushed but didn't deny it. Is it too soon, Catherine? Sometimes I feel guilty for being this happy. Catherine took her sister's hand. Thomas would want you to be happy. He'd want you to live fully, not spend the rest of your life mourning. And Declan is a good man. Anyone can see that. As autumn painted the mountains gold and red, Declan felt himself transforming in ways he couldn't have imagined 6 months earlier. The hard shell he'd built around his heart had dissolved completely. He laughed easily now, shared his thoughts and feelings without constant guard, and dared to dream about the future. He also began to heal old wounds. One evening, he told Emma about his father's death in detail, something he'd never shared with anyone. Emma listened without interruption, then held him as he finally allowed himself to grieve not just the loss, but the years he'd wasted running from it. Your father sounds like he was an extraordinary man, Emma said softly. I think he'd be proud of you, not for becoming invulnerable, but for finding the courage to be vulnerable again. In October, William took Declan on a ride to check distant fence lines. As they worked, William said, I've been thinking. There's a quarter section of land adjacent to my property that's available for homesteading. Good water, decent grazing. If a man filed a claim and worked it properly, he could build a decent ranch. Declan looked at the land in question, rolling grassland backed by forest, with a creek running through it. It was beautiful, and the possibilities made his mind race. I don't have enough saved yet for all the materials I'd need to build. Catherine and I have been discussing that. What if we loaned you what you need? You could pay us back over time, no interest. Consider it an investment in family. Family, Declan repeated, the word tasting like hope. You're going to marry Emma eventually. Everyone knows it, even if you're both being properly patient. That makes you family, and family helps family build something lasting. Declan felt his throat tighten with emotion. I don't know what to say, that's incredibly generous. Say yes, file that homestead claim. Start building your future with Emma. Life's too short, and the frontier's too hard to wait longer than necessary for happiness. That evening, Declan took Emma for a walk to show her the land. They stood on a small rise, looking out over what could be their future, his and hers together. "I can see a house there," Emma said, pointing, "near the creek but high enough to avoid flooding, and corrals over there. Maybe a barn eventually. You'd really want this, a simple ranch life with a former drifter cowboy." Emma turned to him, her blue eyes serious. "Declan, I don't want a simple life with you. I want a full life, with all its challenges and joys, its hard work and rewards. I want to build something meaningful together, raise children together, grow old together. That's not simple, that's everything." Declan pulled her close, mindful of William watching from a respectful distance. "I love you, Emma Jane Johnson. I want to spend the rest of my life proving how much. I love you too, and you've already proved it 100 times over." Winter came to Montana with fierce beauty. Snow blanketed the landscape and temperatures plummeted. The work became harder, breaking ice on water troughs, digging out livestock, fighting to keep everyone and everything alive through the brutal cold. But inside the Morris Ranch house, warmth and life flourished. Declan spent evenings with the family, playing with the children, helping Emma with various tasks, feeling himself weave deeper into the fabric of this small community. For Christmas, he carved a wooden toy horse for each of the boys and a rattle for the baby. Emma gave him a thick wool scarf she'd knitted herself, and he wore it every day like a badge of honor. On Christmas evening, as snow fell softly outside, Declan and Emma sat together by the fire. 6 months had passed since they'd met on that dusty Montana road, 6 months that had transformed both their lives completely. "Sometimes I think about that day you found me stranded," Emma said softly. "What would have happened if you'd ridden past? I probably would have died out there. I couldn't ride past, something stopped me, fate, providence, whatever you want to call it." "I call it love," Emma said. "Maybe not love for me specifically, not yet, but the capacity for love that you'd buried but never quite killed. It saved both of us that day." Declan realized she was right. By stopping to help Emma, he hadn't just saved her life, he'd reclaimed his own. She'd given him back his heart, his hope, his future. "3 more months until your mourning period ends," he said. "3 more months and I can ask you properly." Emma smiled. "I can wait 3 months for forever." Spring arrived with dramatic suddenness, snow melting into rushing creeks, wildflowers exploding across the meadows. Declan filed his homestead claim and began the work of building. William, true to his word, loaned him materials and money. Neighbors came to help with the heavy work of raising the house frame, frontier cooperation that made survival possible in this harsh land. Emma was there every day, planning their home with infectious enthusiasm. She insisted on a large kitchen and a spacious porch. "For our children someday," she said, then blushed at her own boldness. "However many you want," Declan replied, pulling her close. "Fill the house with life and laughter. I can't think of anything better." On March 15th, exactly 1 year after Thomas had died, Emma removed her black mourning ribbon. That evening, Declan asked William for permission to marry Emma. Though it was a formality at this point, he wanted to honor tradition and family. William gave his blessing with a warm handshake and genuine smile. "You've proven yourself tenfold, Declan. Emma couldn't ask for a better husband." Declan found Emma on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. He knelt before her, taking her hand in his. "Emma Jane Johnson, nearly a year ago I was a lost man running from everything that mattered. You showed me a different way, that love isn't weakness, that vulnerability is courage, that building something lasting is worth every risk. I love you more than I thought possible. Will you marry me? Will you build this life with me, be my partner in everything, and let me spend the rest of my days trying to deserve you?" Tears streamed down Emma's face as she pulled him up and wrapped her arms around him. "Yes, yes to all of it. I'll marry you, Declan Yarrow, and I'll love you for the rest of my life." They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with neighbors from surrounding homesteads in attendance. Catherine cried throughout, and William stood proudly as Declan's best man. Emma wore a simple white dress she and Catherine had sewn together, with wildflowers in her blonde hair. Declan had never seen anything more beautiful. As he said his vows, Declan thought about how far he'd traveled, not in miles but in understanding. He'd believed the frontier demanded hardness, isolation, emotional armor. But Emma had taught him that even in the harshest landscape, love could flourish. That caring for someone didn't make you weak, it gave you something worth fighting for. That building a life together was the bravest thing two people could do. "I love you," he said as they sealed their marriage with a kiss. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," Emma whispered back. "We're in this together now for all of it." They moved into their new house, still unfinished but functional, the next week. The homestead was modest but solid, built to last. Each room represented their combined dreams and effort. On their first night there, as they sat together watching the stars through the open window, Emma rested her head on Declan's shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible, you." "Completely happy. This home, this life we're building, it's everything I dreamed of." Declan tightened his arm around her. "I spent 3 years thinking survival meant staying alone. Turns out real survival, real living, requires exactly the opposite. It requires someone to share it all with." "Your cowboy heart was stolen that day you stopped to help me," Emma said with a smile. "But I think maybe you stole mine right back." "Fair trade," Declan agreed, "the best one I ever made." In the months and years that followed, Declan and Emma's ranch grew and prospered. They faced challenges, hard winters, dry summers, occasional brushes with outlaws and wild animals. But they faced everything together, their love deepening with each shared trial and triumph. Catherine and William remained close neighbors and friends. The two families helped each other constantly, building the kind of community that made frontier life not just survivable but meaningful. When Emma gave birth to their first child, a son, Catherine was there to help. When William broke his leg during a bad storm, Declan managed both ranches until he healed. Declan never forgot the man he'd been when he first found Emma stranded by the roadside, hard, closed off, convinced that isolation was strength. That man seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who understood that real courage meant opening your heart despite the risks, that love was worth any sacrifice, and that the frontier was harsh precisely because it demanded human connection to survive. On their 5th anniversary, Declan and Emma stood on their porch at sunset, watching their 2 children play in the yard, the boy now 4, and a daughter just learning to walk. Emma was expecting their 3rd child. The ranch had grown to include a substantial herd and several outbuildings. It was everything they'd dreamed of building together. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked. "Stopping for that stranded widow? Taking the risk of caring again?" Declan pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her rounded belly where their next child grew. "Not for 1 second. You gave me back my life, Emma. You taught me that love isn't what makes the frontier dangerous. Love is what makes it worth surviving." Emma smiled up at him, the same smile that had captured his heart years ago. "We make a good team, you and I." "The best team," Declan agreed, "the forever kind." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Declan Yarrow held his wife close and watched their children play. He thought about the broken man he'd been, the broken woman he'd found, and the beautiful life they'd built from their shared brokenness. The frontier was still harsh. Winter would still be brutal, drought would still threaten, and danger would always lurk beyond the light of home fires. But facing it together, with love as their foundation and hope as their compass, made all the difference. His cowboy heart had indeed been stolen that day he stopped to help a stranded widow. But in return, Emma had given him something infinitely more valuable, a life worth living, a love worth protecting, and a future filled with promise. And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Declan Yarrow knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man in all the West. The frontier had taken much from him, but it had also given him everything that mattered. It had given him Emma, their children, this life they'd built together. It had given him home.